Thank you, Stu. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to the Auckland Unitarian Church. Unlike many other churches, we don't have a creed. Instead, we have principles of how we should act together. The full set of principles is over there on the wall. Today, I'd like to concentrate on the fourth one, which is that we stand for a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So we hope you will enjoy this service and feel a sense of freedom. Freedom to think, freedom to share your thoughts with the rest of us, and freedom to question what other people have said. Feel free. We especially welcome visitors. We invite you to join us in a cup of tea or coffee after the service. Welcome. My theme for today is my doctor told me to take it easy, and there was a similar theme in a saying from Jesus. He is supposed to have said, "Come to me, all you labour and are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So religion, he is saying, is not all about dedication and hard work. There is also a place for rest. I light this candle as a symbol of all the hopes and wishes that we share. May our concerns be lightened and our goals strengthened as we think about these things together. Well, I got today's sermon idea from my doctor. When I saw her a couple of weeks ago, she said, "You need to take it easy." She was talking about the heart attack I had last July and how I'm still at risk of having another one. And she knows that I have often been exhausted with legal campaigning about religion in schools. And so she said, "How is it going?" And I said, "Well, it's still going to be very busy the next month." This was about a month ago I was talking to her. But I said it might get easier after last Tuesday, because that's when our court case goes before the judge. But taking it easy is not easy. I told her I can't stop fighting this case. I believe in it. I can't stop until it's over. But obviously then, I'm not an expert in this matter of taking it easy. In fact, I'm a very bad problem case. But I'd like to share a few thoughts about it and invite your comments afterwards, if you have any. My first thought was that saying of Jesus about, "Come to me, you who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." That sounds almost too good to be true, but I remembered a sermon about this by Christian philosopher Paul Tillich about 50 years ago, and it must have been a very good sermon, because I could still remember about 3/4 of it, because my wife Marion was a fan of him as well. She's got a book which includes that sermon, and when we looked it up, I could remember it, about 6 of the points that he made. One of the points that Paul Tillich made was that Jesus can't take away our labour. He can't take away the responsibilities and troubles that crowd in on it. But he said that Jesus could remove some of the stress of our labour. And he said that stress comes from religion. Now, Paul was obviously one of the death of God philosophers, and I would not agree with him that all of our stresses come from religion, but I would agree that religion can cause some kinds of stress. And in fact, that is what Paul Tillich was really stretching things to say this on the basis of one text. But I looked up other texts also in Matthew's Gospel, And there was a place where Jesus says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you load heavy burdens on men's backs, and you will not lift a finger to help them yourself. And Matthew's gospel goes on to describe those heavy loads that the scribes and Pharisees put on people. One was that they had to obey lots of food regulations. One was that they had to wash their hands before meals, which Jesus regarded as a great hassle. Another was keeping the Sabbath, which was a great hassle for many people, and still is. I was quite surprised when I started speaking to Jewish people in Auckland that many of them feel they have to live near the synagogue because the Sabbath law says you're not allowed to walk, or their interpretation of it is you're not allowed to walk more than, I think it's a couple of 100 metres. And so that means you've got to live near the synagogue. And there are, I believe, some Jews conservative Jews who do that, but I also know some who ignore it, and they have thrown off this burden. But it's definitely quite true that Jesus regarded the laws and traditions of the Jews as a heavy burden, and he offered to lighten them because he said, these do not matter. He said, I don't care if I fast like they say, I don't care if I wash my hands like they say, and he relieved people of those kinds of religious hassle. But I would have to say the other side, it's the parts of Matthew that were getting stuck into the scribes and Pharisees. I know from my own study that those were not all said by Jesus, that they reflect a time much later than the time of Jesus, when the Pharisees were really getting heavy and were throwing the Christians out of their synagogues. And the Christians were going around the world inviting people from other religions to join. So that kind of hassle did not happen in Jesus' time, but it definitely did happen a few decades later. And to be fair to the Jews, I would have to say that they also had this idea of religion being a yoke on your shoulders. And they said, if you take the yoke of the commands of God on your shoulders, it will lighten your other burdens, such as the risk of being thrown into jail for breaking the law, other hassles that society puts on you. A good Jew will not feel those hassles because he has his faith to go with him. So they too had this idea that if you take the yoke of religion on you, it can be a source of comfort and strength. Another commentator I read who I think said the most helpful side of it, they said that a yoke, as you know, was a wooden frame that they put on the shoulders of oxen when they're dragging a load or towing a plough behind them. And if the yoke was well made, it would fit their shoulders, would spread the load over. But if it was badly made and badly fitting, it would cause them pain and irritation. And a commentator who told me about this said, Jesus, as a carpenter, would have known how to make a yoke, how to make it one that was comfortable and one that made the load easier to pull. Now, a yoke does not remove the load, but it makes it easier for you to pull it. And I noticed that a number of people in the last few months, when we've been talking about Islam, because of the Christchurch shooting, have been commenting on some of the Muslim laws and saying they regard them as a real burden, and in particular the laws about women wearing the burqa, and they say this is a symbol of oppression of women by men. But I myself have met Muslim women in the past few months who say that is not true. There are certainly parts of the world where the burqa is oppressive, and in Iran, I understand that a woman lawyer was thrown in jail for basically fighting against the burqa. But the Muslim women in New Zealand say it is not a burden for us. We do this of our own will. So there's three religions which have all got the idea of a burden in them, but for some people that burden is good. It gives them a pride in their religion to have these rules and regulations that we might regard as tough. So the idea is widespread, but different people, different religions have different ideas of what kind of yoke will help them. Another kind of pain caused by religion is guilt. And this has been a feature, I regret to say, of Christianity for centuries, how it tries to make people feel guilty so that Jesus can come along and forgive them. I think of Israel Folau saying how gay people are going to go to hell when they die because they are breaking God's law. And a very oppressive yoke that he is making of, a guilt trip for gay people. But I must say that he is not the only one who experiences religion as a source of guilt. A couple of weeks ago, Clay was talking about racism, and I was surprised to hear one of our members saying that he was born a racist. And I can't remember who it was who said that. My apologies if they're here. But he was talking about being white, and that this made him part of a, I'm interpreting, but because he was white, he was inheriting the advantages that white people have over Maori in New Zealand, and he's had that just by being born white. Well, that to me sounds like a yoke of guilt. That is very similar to the ancient idea in the book of Genesis, which says that humans were all born guilty because their parents, Adam and Eve, ate the apple in the garden. I don't believe that idea myself. I would say I personally don't feel guilty about being white, though I do feel quite a bit of pressure to feel guilty from other religious people. And I feel a similar pressure to feel guilty about sexism, as though I personally must do something to end it. When I say I don't feel a sense of guilt, I do feel a sense of obligation. There are these inequalities in society, and all of us must do what we can to fix them, but not as though it was our sole responsibility. It is a burden that some people want to give more attention to than others. What do you think about that one? I'll give you a chance to comment afterwards. I was brought up a Methodist, and we were taught to have a sense of guilt about the problem of alcohol. They taught that even if you drank alcohol in moderation, you were not being a good Christian. And they said the reason is there's a passage written by St. Paul which talks about people who drink and people who don't drink. And he said that we should accept other people's burdens and we should not put stumbling blocks in their way. And the Methodists took that to mean that none of us should drink anything, because that way we are putting a stumbling block in the way of people for whom alcohol is a problem. Does that feel like a heavy load? I did. I was a total abstainer for my first about 25 years or so. And then one day I was a minister at this time, and I went to a church wedding, and they had wine there, and a drunk guy came up to me and with a very slurred speech says, "I'm proud of you, Reverend, for not drinking any alcohol." And I thought, the hell, I'm not here to make a protest about alcohol. He can sort out his own alcoholism. And so I got a glass of wine and had one. That was when I stopped being a total abstainer. So that definitely was a guilt trip, which the Methodist Church had. And I was not the first one to take a glass of wine. It stopped being a requirement on Methodists about in the 1950s somewhere. So I was actually one of the last to start being a social drinker. But anyway, that was a source of guilt for many. But I think Paul Tillich does a mistake, and others do a mistake, by saying that it's only Christians who do this. There are all sorts of people with no religious bone to pick who put pressure on others and on themselves. Many people face a pressure to be perfect. Many people face a pressure to be competitive and to be the top of their jobs. Many school students, my daughter is a teacher who specialises in teaching foreign students. And she said many Chinese students face huge pressure from their parents to come top of their class. And they are half asleep when they come to school because they've been up so late doing their homework. So there are all kinds of people, not just religious people, piling pressures on them. And there's, of course, these are pressures from other people, but there's the pressures of our own high goals. Many of us share these high goals, and so when other people criticise us for not doing it, we feel bad because we know we're not doing it, we feel we should. So that our own goals can be a great source of pressure. But one of the kinds of pressure that the story of Nasrudin's donkey makes to us is the pressure of other people's expectations. I love the way the donkey, poor old Nasrudin, he starts off being criticised for making his son walk, then he puts his son on the donkey and comes under pressure for walking himself, and then they both get on, they come under pressure for abusing the poor donkey. It's to Nasrudin's credit, he makes a joke of this. But that really is a burden, isn't it? All of us face multiple pressures to fit in with other people. And I recall Clay giving a slightly different ending to the story. He said the answer, in Clay's version, the donkey doesn't drown. Nasrudin goes back and puts his boy on the donkey like it was before, and because that's what he really believed in. He himself thought a little kid should have a ride more than himself, and so he did what he believed was right. So I agree with that interpretation. That's not quite the interpretation in the slides. But when an example for me, after I came back home from my doctor saying I need to take it easy, my wife Marion said, "Yes, that's your legal campaign. You ought to be taking it easy there." And I thought, I don't want to take it easy. It's my goal. I get satisfaction out of it as well as trouble. And I thought, I should not throw away that. I should be throwing away something else. And I remembered also that Marion herself is highly overworked, is in chair of dozens of school church committees, and she herself is exhausted, and she's exhausted about different things. So we should not be criticising each other for having a different burden. So that's, to me, that's one of the answers to my doctor, to say there are many kinds of pressure which we should be taking off our backs, but different people are going to have different pressures. So Nasrudin was aware of that, but St. Paul, who was always quoted as being on the side of total abstinence, he was aware of the very same problem. In the book of Romans, he discussed people who had different goals within the same church. Some of them came from a Jewish background and still valued their Jewish traditions, such as the Sabbath. They still believed in keeping the Sabbath. Others came from a Greek background and couldn't be bothered with things like the Sabbath. And these two groups were both very judgmental about the other group. And Paul said, and to me this is one of the brighter points in the whole New Testament, he said, "Who are you to pass judgment on someone else's servant?" In other words, he's saying that you are all servants of God, but you are not be telling other people what they should do as servants. They have their own different kind of service to do. And Paul goes on to say, "It is before their own Lord that they stand or fall, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand." So this is, to me, and that's the same passage that the Methodist Church interpreted, saying the people who are total abstainers should identify with the others. Paul was not saying that. He was saying that those who drank should not feel guilty, and those who did drink should not feel guilty. He's saying neither of them should be feeling guilty. So, and not only should we not criticise, but if we don't criticise and if we can accept other people's differences, then we are actually lightening their load for them. We are offering them our moral support, even though we don't agree with what they're doing. By respecting their freedom of thought, we make their load a little lighter. And that fourth principle there, freedom of thought, the other half, not stated there, one half is that we are free, but the other half is that we should encourage other people to be free, and that means we should be encouraging people who think different from us. And that way we make a very healthy, helpful society. I'd like to give a couple of modern examples of me trying to do this. I had a discussion a few weeks ago with some atheists who had no respect at all for Muslims, and they were talking about this burqa issue. And I was going to say to them, don't be so bigoted. The burqa is not a symbol of oppression all the time. But instead, I modified what I said. I thought I shouldn't be criticising him. I should say, is it right, and this is what I did say, is it right to assume that New Zealand Muslims are under the same pressure as they are in Iran? And so I just made my point, but I still made it much more gently. In another conversation with atheists over the same issue, I had just said that I was going to visit a mosque, which I did, and so did Paul Harrison. The two of us went to a mosque. And when we discussed this in the Humanists and Rationalists meeting, one guy got up and said, well, I'm sorry, I can't identify with Muslims. But this was a perfectly friendly conversation. He was not hauling me over the coals. He was just expressing his difference. And that is the kind of disagreement that can be helpful. Both he and I are good friends. I don't call him a racist. I could if I wanted to, but I don't. It would be unhelpful. In a third example, a week ago here in the church annual meeting, we were debating whether to charge a minimum donation before someone could have voting rights at the annual meeting. And I voted against it, and someone else asked me why I voted no. So I told her, but my reason for not explaining that in the meeting was I'd already spoken on this twice before, and if I was to speak on it a third time, I would be bashing people over the head who think differently. They know what I think. Why should I rub it in and try and make people feel bad for having a different opinion from me? So if we are being sensitive to other people, we should be especially sensitive to those who think differently from us. There are lots of ways of helping us cope with hard work, but one of them is to have an accepting group of friends, like I hope we have here. Another is to join pressure groups with people who share our properties. Another is to have life coaches who can help us. And there are also personal disciplines like prayer and meditation. I used to believe in prayer, and I found it very supportive. In fact, I continued praying for some decades after I was an atheist, not thinking God was there, but just valuing the way that we talk about our hopes and priorities. And of course, what we do with our candle is really like a prayer without the God in it, isn't it? It is still expressing what is a matter of concern. That can be a big help. So that's my answer to the problem of load. That we cannot get rid of the load, but we can be selective in the load, and we can get a load that fits us and fits other people better. So that's my answer to that question of stress. If anyone else would like to come up, come and have the microphone and say what you think.
Hi, I'm Vivian. I'm not sure if this is completely on topic, but it is about stress and how to take it easy. I noticed when I worked for corporates that there was this growing sense of if you're not looking like you want to work 60 hours a week, you're considered lazy. And there's this sort of looking at each other within a company, and people who overwork get praised, and the ones who work 9 to 5 are considered, again, lazy. I didn't like this. I felt that people should have choices, that sometimes they are doing other things. They're very busy outside their work life. And why can't we just work 9 to 5? That doesn't mean to say you don't give, you're not attentive to your work, but it means you shouldn't have to work extra.
I think in your case with the doctor, you just have to look at your life and choose the things that you'll get rewards from for your health's sake. So the work that you're putting into the school religious instruction is something that you're benefiting from. You just leave all the domestic chores and forget about them.
I'm Alexandra. All through my life, I had a lot of pressure from family, mainly, and a lot of it was to do with religion, conforming, looking good. Part of it was because being a well-known business family, we were all recognizable, and you felt that you were on show all the time. You could be recognized everywhere you went and be judged, and stories would get back if you were doing anything you shouldn't do. But what I really want to say to you all is, just live long enough. All the people who put me under pressure are dead. And my life now is really great.
Like David with his Bible in Schools project, the pressure comes from yourself, I gather. And it's very much, in my case, I'm not pressured by anyone. But I am, apart from me, and compulsively publishing books. And I look around, and I enjoy it, and I can't imagine a life not publishing. But I feel, if I try and sit down and relax and do something relaxing, I think, oh God, no, I've got this book, there's other things I've got to do, and I'm all the time. And I look around friends who have reached a similar age to me, and they're sitting around, just taking life easy, and I think, I can't do that. How can I do that? I'm struggling with it.
I'm Lynn. I think that some of us live to work and some of us work to live. And for me, I had the opportunity to buy into in fact, almost be given a partnership in a business that had a lot of potential and had a lot of capacity to earn a lot of money. But because I know that I'm such a stress bunny and be stressing about the other person's decisions and the conflicts that would arise because my ideas would be different to theirs, I actually gave it a miss. And I am perfectly happy to go in and do my hours of work diligently and well, and then leave it. And just leave those things, because I just find I cannot cope with the level of stress that's demanded. But then I love to, as you say, some things you just do because you love them. So if I stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning completing an art project, I'm going to do it. And my husband was saying, you can't do that to your body, you can't do that to your body. Well, actually, it's true. I can't really do it to my body. But the fact is, I love it, so I do it. So.
In the 1930s and 40s, economists were predicting that by the 1980s, a real challenge would be what we would do with all of our leisure time. Because it was apparent, just extrapolating trends at the time, that we would have to work only 2 days a week, 3-4 hours a day. I mean, that was evident. And yet that hasn't happened, And why hasn't it happened? Even my parents' generation, a single wage earner with a high school education could support a family, And now we'll have two wage earners with good skills and education, and they can't make ends meet, and they've got to work all kinds of hours, and it's. And by contrast, was it Rachel in a sermon here talking of history of union movements and such, and there was this it's hard to find a builder in Auckland now, but this back in the 19th century there was a famous early union guy who said, he had queues of people wanting to build his house, and he said I'll work 8 hours a day, no more, and then we sleep 8, work 8, and then have 8 to do the other things, And that's, but pick up on what Vivian said. There's a place where that would be looked down upon. You're expected to come early and stay late, and then we lose that work-life balance, right? When it all goes to work and you don't have it for family and leisure and such. I had, years ago, I rented a room in the house of a woman who had survived the siege of Leningrad. You know, had buried family members in mass graves who died from starvation and things. And she was fond of saying, happiness comes from little things, you know. If you think you're going to be happy when you acquire or obtain this and that, or go here or there, or do this and that, you'll never be happy. You need to learn to take pleasure in just the daily little manifestations of life, just a meal with friends and family, just simple things. Yeah.
Thanks very much, everyone. My closing words of, I thought I should get another story from Nasrudin. A neighbour came to Nasrudin's house one day, so he asked if he could borrow his donkey. Nasrudin was not feeling very generous, so he said, I'm sorry, I've lent him to my brother-in-law this week. As the neighbour walked away, the donkey in the backyard let out a rowdy hee-haw. The neighbour turned around and said, it seems to me your donkey has come back home. What makes you think that? Said Nasrudin. Well, said the neighbour, I just heard him. You idiot, said Nasrudin. Who would you trust more, a man or a donkey?